You're listening to Body Banter, a podcast where we have conversations about the human body in all its forms and from as many perspectives we can find.
We are your hosts, Shagun Yedele
and Claudia Krebs.
And we are professors of anatomy in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada.
Anatomy is for everybody and every body, and we're here to get the body banter going.
We hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Body Banter. Today, I am coming to you from Kelowna, which is in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Silk Okanagan Nation. As usual, I am Shagun, and I have with me Claudia. Hi, Claudia.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you from Vancouver on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. I am so thrilled to have Janet Philp on the podcast with us today. Janet, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Janet Philp, and I'm joining you from Edinburgh, the capital city of Scotland, where I work here at the University of Edinburgh. I work in the medical school. I'm not employed as an anatomist, but I am doing a PhD in anatomical sciences.
That's really cool. And you have a long history of studying anatomy and, being an anatomist, even though you're not employed as an anatomist. I like that sort of distinction there. Why don't you tell us about your journey into anatomy?
Okay, so I guess my journey started, I was a fitness instructor and sports coach, and I got to the point where I was going along to courses and they were teaching me things that I knew were wrong. The real tipping point was a talk about the knee where the person managed to double up the number of ligaments in the knee. And so I thought there must be a better way for me to learn anatomy than this. And because I was working at the medical school, I stumbled literally across the anatomical teaching program of the Anatomical Society of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, I think it's called, where it's a sort of modular approach. And so long as you had access to dissection and a mentor at your institute, you could undertake this course. And so I approached the heads of anatomy, who were at that point Gordon Finlayter and Tom Gillingwater, and they agreed that they would mentor me. The understanding at the beginning was I was just doing the module on musculoskeletal, but even then they said, no, you need a whole year preparing before you start this, which in hindsight was great because Gordon persuaded me I had to learn embryology. And it was the last year he was teaching embryology before he retired. And so I got to study embryology for a year with Gordon Finlayter. But obviously the story changed and I carried on and I actually did all 4 modules of that. I did the postgraduate diploma that they had just started online there. And after doing that, I'm now continue doing a staff studentship PhD, part-time PhD, as well as doing my job at the medical school. Although I now have moved on to study anatomists rather than anatomy, which is interesting. And on top of that, I guess if we go back before I started all that anatomy stuff, we have our anatomical museum here that hosts the skeleton of William Burke. And we still do open once a month to the public. And the public would come in and tell the most ludicrous stories about Burke and Hare. And so for the 4 years before I started studying anatomy, I studied Burke and Hare and produced a book, a retelling of the Burke and Hare story from the view of the skeleton of Burke, which is sort of half and half. It's half the story and half all of the research and references as to why the story is told that way. So that was published in 2016, I think. And actually, I've got a TV appointment in 2 weeks' time. There's still people that contact me about filming and TV appearances and podcasts to do with Burke and Hare because it's just people are fascinated by it for some reason.
Well, I think it's obvious the fascination with it. what prompted you to tell the story from the point of view of the skeleton?
Well, it was novel. It hadn't been done before. There have actually been books before that tell the story from Burke's point of view. Well, what they suppose is Burke's point of view. I think the idea of telling it from the skeleton gave you the opportunity for him to reflect on his behavior and the subsequent development of how anatomy has progressed since 1832. So it could add in comments about people that came to the museum, comments about the roof leaking, these sorts of things. But it gave him, talking as if it was actually, but it gave the possibility of a long period of time to reflect on what he'd actually done.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with the story, what is the story of Burke and Hare?
So the story of Burke and Hare, they were two Irish immigrants who were in Edinburgh in 1828, and from the end of 1828 until the end of 1829, pretty much over sort of 12 to 16 months, they killed 16 people and provided their bodies to, not to the university, but to Robert Knox, who was running his own anatomical school at the time. So Knox was able to have fresh specimens, which obviously attracted more students to his school. I mean, it's obviously horrendous. They provided him with 17 bodies. The first person had actually died naturally, but after that they started killing people. So it's one of the great misconceptions in Edinburgh that they were actually grave robbers, and just got a bit lazy, but they never actually dug up a grave at all. They went straight to killing people. And until recently, they were actually the UK's most prolific serial killers. That is the story, I guess. They were eventually caught. Hare turned King's evidence, so he was immune from prosecution if he gave the information that secured the sentencing of Burke, I guess. So Burke was sentenced to death and was hung. His body was then dissected at the medical school, and it was said in the courtroom that should it ever become customary to keep skeletons, that his skeleton should be kept so that people remembered his crimes. And so his skeleton is still hanging in the Anatomical Museum in Edinburgh.
That brings up such an interesting notion that was quite common back then and before, that anatomical dissection was part of punishment. Do you want to comment on that, like, and how that has changed?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I mean, there's a big book by Ruth Richardson of Destitute. I can't remember the name of it now, but about that whole thing about how dissection was part of the punishment. And then we had the 1832 Act in the UK that moved that away. They got rid of the Murder Act, which was what tied dissection. You could only dissect the bodies of people who were executed for murder. So there were very few people that were actually executed for murder, which was why there was such a trade in grave robbing, because they needed more bodies than they could actually get. The 1832 Act in the UK removed dissection from the murderers, but it placed it on the people that were in the poorhouses and institutions. And so it removed dissection from its criminal thing, but then connected to the poor and made the poor almost the equivalent of criminals, which obviously wasn't a good move or popular. And I mean, you say we have progressed, but then there's this issue, in various places down in Texas, I think it is, for example, where they've got rid of, if somebody dies and they haven't got any family to bury them, it used to be, and it is the case over here, that the state would provide the funeral. Whereas various places, and I believe it's happening in Texas, they now just provide that body to the medical school to save the cost of the funeral. I'm getting quite a depressive note, I guess, but I'm not convinced that we're progressing too much away from the 1800s. We seem to be going backwards.
Right. And we're going to come back to this line because it connects with your PhD and some of the findings that has been coming up in your PhD, but I wanted to take us on a slight detour to talk about felt anatomy and some of the things that you are also very well known for, creating these anatomical models and parts from felt anatomy. Can you describe that work?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure where it started. I mean, I started off felting little rabbits and things like normal people do. And then I think possibly the first one I did was a netter dissection, a picture of the neck dissection from netter. And I just wondered if it could be produced in felt. And so produced all the individual muscles, and to get it all to lay right, you actually have to produce all the blood vessels that are hidden under the muscles to make sure it lays right, and realized that actually that was quite a good way of learning it. It really made you think about all the structures because you had to create them all and put them all together. And that got sent off to somebody. And I then were like, oh, I wonder if you could do a whole skull. And so a lot of these things were experiments to see if they could be done. So I did a section of the spinal cord, but it was quite big. And it actually went down to the National Undergraduate Neuroanatomy competition guys when they used to be down in Southampton. But then I wondered if you could do it small enough and quick enough that it could actually be done with students as a workshop, which is the smaller one that Claudia's got. And then it just kind of progressed. So I think I wondered whether it could be done with histology. And so Jamie Chapman sent me across a picture of a section of a knee joint. And so I tried that and sent that back to Jamie. And then also there was Amanda Mayer had a brain MRI that she had on the front of a textbook, which was actually her brain. And so I got in touch and wondered if she would share the file, and managed to do that with sort of white wool on black velvet. So it was really black. And you could see the real contrast of an MRI sort of picture. And I think, I did a human heart, and we had that at one of our public engagement things. And it was when you were describing the vessels on the outside of the human heart, and it was sort of life size. And you could say to the member of the public, you see this line here, this is the artery that, if that gets blocked, that's a heart attack. And they were like, but it's so small. And just being able to see it in 3D and then being able to see how small these structures are, really, it seems to be a really good way of communicating with non-anatomists about internal parts of the body that they wouldn't normally see. And because it's like a jumper, it's soft and fluffy, it's like a sheep. I mean, it is a sheep, I guess, but they didn't have any problems with handling it and turning it around. And you can imagine that they wouldn't do that with a hard model, that they wouldn't. Well, in this country, they wouldn't get the opportunity to do it with the actual organ. So it was such a good way of communicating about that. And then I guess Leonard Shapiro got in touch with us and asked us to write a book chapter for one of the biomedical visualization things, which then produced. So Joan Smith, who I work with, who used to be at the Edinburgh College of Art, and so has lots of experience on teaching things through the creative process. She and I wrote this book chapter, which we called it Palpation: The Art of Felt Anatomy, because we were going for sort of a pun on words of actually palpating people. And that seems to have been really popular with people, the idea that you can learn things through this creative process. I did a public workshop at a pre-conference workshop at one of the AAA conferences, which wasn't actually felt, it was braiding, where we made a brachial plexus out of braiding bits of thread together. And I had joined up with Sarah McConnell, who does crochet and embryonic folding. So there's lots of people out there doing these sorts of things, but they're kind of doing them in isolation at the moment. And whilst we were writing that book chapter, Joan and I had written a previous book chapter about the fabric of human anatomy. Again, we were going for a pun on Vesalius, but we had looked at embroidery and knitting and lots of different ways of doing it, not just felt. And some of those were collaborative community projects. So there's people down in Lancashire who the whole village had knitted various organs that then fitted together to make this body for a primary school. So we thought, I wonder if we could do that with something felting. We've been involved in the Kajal embroidery project. So during lockdown, they had produced lots of Kajal's pictures of neurons, and they had asked 81, it must have been 81 people to produce embroideries, which have been knitted, sewn together into this massive, large embroidery, which featured in the Lancet. I think it actually made the front cover of the Lancet. So we knew these sorts of things were possible. So we got some funding from the Anatomical Society, and we made up kits that, I mean, we launched the idea at an Anatomy Society meeting over here in Nottingham in 2023. We put it up on a web page and advertised it to the felting community in the UK, and we had to shut it down 2 days later because we were just overwhelmed with people wanting to join in. We sent them these kits that had the instructions, a plastic vertebrae, some wool, and the needles, so they could make a vertebrae and then send it back to us. We didn't actually include return postage, so each person paid to send their vertebrae back to us. And we strung them all up to make this sort of 1.5 meter high model. Some people have been sent colored wool, and so we had this spiral of vertebrae up the middle of colored wool to give the suggestion of spinal curves. And then we had these individual white vertebrae sort of rotating around it, which was amazing. But what was more amazing, and we weren't anticipating, was the comments that came back from the people who had taken part. So an awful lot of the public took part because they'd had back issues. And if they told us which part of the back they'd had issues with, we sent them the appropriate vertebrae. So they were making something that was really relevant to them. A lot of people came back with comments about they'd had a medical condition and they hadn't really understood it. It had been explained at the time of their operation, but the doctor was busy and they didn't want to disturb them. So they hadn't really understood it. But now, having made this vertebrae, they did. And we had this one really poignant case where somebody's mother had fallen during the project. Her mother had fallen over and had damaged her C2, C3 vertebrae. And actually her mother had died the following week. And she came back saying that she hadn't really understood, but now, having made this neck vertebrae, she understood what had happened to her mother. And so the effect was just amazing for such a simple project.
You have such a fascinating approach to human anatomy, starting with sort of your reflections on Burke and the book that came out of that, and then really engaging people to create using their hands and simple fuzzy materials like wool to create three-dimensional representations of their body. I am quite touched actually by the story that you just told of how people engage with the vertebrae and understand their own back pain in a more profound way. We see this all the time, that anatomical knowledge in the general population is lacking, right? We all walk around in our human bodies, and we take it for granted that we know how the body is put together because we've been studying it for 20 plus years and teaching it. But most people don't have this knowledge. And yet it's so important for understanding their medical conditions, their pain, or just, how they are put together and how that works. You obviously have this affinity for fiber arts. And you said it was more of an exploration. You start with bunnies and then you made vertebrae and just to see if you could do it. What was that step of taking this craft, which can be quite solitary, into the public? What prompted that?
Okay, to be completely honest, what prompted that was I've got so many things made of felt in my house, I needed to get rid of them. So we took them. So there's a coffee shop in a little, I suppose it's actually a village around the corner from here, where I've got a display cabinet, and it tends to be the bunnies, not the anatomical stuff, but it was in there, and we were selling the leftovers to the public through that coffee shop. And then somebody at the coffee shop said, "Can you run a workshop?" And so now, I don't know, 3 or 4 times a year, we go in after that has shut, after the coffee shop has shut, and we run a course on everybody making a teddy bear, or everybody making a daffodil or something. And so I started doing public workshops. And then I think it was the braiding with the brachial plexus, and it's the realization that actually you can stand in front of a student and you can talk with them or discuss with them, even if flip classroom and they've learned it and it's a discussion to sort of embed their learning. It's not the same as if they've made something. I ran this is completely, again, another off the wall thing. I ran a session for 4th year medics in the experimental kitchen of accommodation services at the university, where we made anatomical biscuits. Okay. So we got cookie cutters, they made the biscuits, they cut them out, they go in and decorate them. And these 2 medics, medical students, made a pelvis and a hip joint. So with the icing, they put the ligaments in place. Now, they weren't great. I wouldn't go as far to say we're wrong, but anatomical variation, it could have been right. But what they drew wasn't textbook placement of the ligaments. But the chef who was running the kitchen was going to go in for a hip operation. He was going in to get an artificial hip put in. And what followed was a sort of 20-minute discussion where those 2 medical students explained to that chef what was going to happen during his operation. And the whole thing came about because they made a biscuit.
That's fascinating. How the whole, personal stories connect with an effort to introduce anatomy to the population, to the general public, and how that is so meaningful at a really personal level to so many people. And I wonder whether you can expand on that, how that communicating anatomy links, like in the academic sense, taking, like in the old parlance, we say meeting of town and gown, how the anatomy that we teach in the university halls and labs can actually make a meaningful connection between academia. It can be a vehicle to connect academia to the community at large. Which is what you're really living that experience in a lot of this work that you do. Can you talk more about that?
I think sometimes we try to be too clever. The number of papers that I've read where they talk about body painting or biscuit making and they describe it as being simple or childish, and there's some idea that you've got to be, if it's the gown coming out to meet the town, then the gown is expected to be sort of a bit highbrow. I'm constantly criticized for not having an academic voice, which I think I take to mean that I speak in a way that people can actually understand what I say. I'm not sure that an academic voice is what you need when you're trying to get your message across to people that don't have the knowledge that you have. I mean, we know from various studies that the understanding, the general public's understanding of their body is pretty poor. And so going in, talking about superior, inferior, anterior, posterior, it's not, you've lost them in the first few words. You've got to meet them where they are. I did a science festival talk it was on neuroscience, but it was based on zombies. And this came from a breakfast conversation with my son, who at the time was studying higher human biology. And he was doing brain functions. And arguably he should have been studying, but what he was doing the evening before was watching The Walking Dead. And so the conversation came about that, okay, that zombie can't walk properly. Which part of the brain do you think is damaged? And that zombie can't talk. Which part of the brain do you think is damaged? And there's a book, The Zombies Dream of Undead Sheep, which is done by two neuroscientists, and they go into it in quite, depth. But the number of people that turned up at that science festival talk because you were going to talk about zombies, I'm sure it was way more than if you said you were going to talk about neuroscience. So, I mean, maybe it's getting them there under false pretenses, but, I think if you're going to try and communicate with the public, you've got to go to where they are, not even meet them halfway. You have to go to where they are.
I 100% agree. And I think talking about zombies is a really good way to talk about the brain. I love this approach, like, let's look at the zombie. What's going on? What do you think? Which part of the brain's being eaten right now? I think that makes a lot of sense because it keeps it light. Otherwise, we're always talking about folks who had strokes or other neurological disorders. And, it's heavy. Zombies are light because they're fictional. I really appreciate that approach of communicating in that way. And I hear you when you say that there's a criticism from sort of the academia world of having to talk in a highbrow way, or else we sort of lose our respectability or whatever. You are doing your PhD exactly about this, how anatomists understand themselves, the professional identity formation in anatomists. I wonder if part of that is prompted by that notion of being considered like an outsider for not using that language when engaging with the public. I don't know. But tell us about how you got into this research and what you're finding there.
Okay, so what drove me into the research to start with? So if you go back to the fact that I came from a sports background, sports massage background, fascia is quite a big thing in massage therapy, and its importance is debatable in medical textbooks. If you look at the standard anatomy book, it doesn't mention it at all. And in the UK, about 10, 15 years ago, there were 4 or 5 people who ran courses where they offered dissection to non-medical people, and they were primarily looking at fascia. That was what they were aimed at. So I mean, the main leader in this would be Gil Headley, who has done tons of dissections and has just actually toured the America talking about nerves with a complete dissection of the entire nervous system. So they ran courses in the UK. 2019, the last one was shut down over here, but it was made, and saying they were shut down is a bit sort of provocative, I guess. It was made so hard for them to do the courses in the UK that they now all operate abroad. I wanted to explore the decisions as to how we decided who could teach by dissection or who could learn by dissection. I mean, there's another debate as to whether that's the best way to learn. But, if we're saying that it's a valid way of learning, why do we only allow some professions to learn that way? And so, I mean, it's different. It's probably, it might be hard for you to relate to in Canada. I don't know if it's Canada the same as America, where, I know of people in America where school kids come into the dissecting room and, school tours are done and these sorts of things. Yeah, not in the UK. Nobody gets into the dissecting room in the UK.
We don't let school children into the dissecting room here either.
So I went out with the idea of exploring how these decisions were made, but I went out semi-structured interviews. So it wasn't a list of questions, it was a list of topics we were going to explore. But in the heart of this, I presented them with 12 professions and said, would you let them in? If you were running your own dissection facility and there was no legislation, and if you agreed to let this profession in, you would have got consent from your donors. That was after an interview where the only reply I got was if there was consent all the way through. So I changed it to be that scenario. You would have got consent. that being the case, and you're the only person who's making decisions, would you allow this profession in? And the results are just, I guess there's been no studies looking at this. I'm surprised. It's not what I was expecting. I don't know what I was expecting. Not this, and it's very hard to explain.
Were you trying to look at maybe possible hierarchy in the professions, that type of gatekeeping in the professions, rather than whether that dissection is useful for learning a particular type of, say, trade, to use that word loosely. So maybe other professions who deal with anatomy in one form or the other might also benefit from anatomy, but they are not currently being allowed to use dissection. Was that the question that in your mind?
That's what came out. So partly there was a hierarchy. Some people revealed that they had a hierarchy of the value of just society for these 12 professions. Some people were horrified when they realized they had a value, because they wanted to say that they would educate anybody. And then when put on the spot, they realized they wouldn't. That there was a debate as to how much anatomy certain professions actually needed to know. There was quite a lack of knowledge as to how much anatomy some professions did need to know. I mean, they were quite hands up. Like, I've got no idea how much anatomy they need to know, but I would think they need to know quite a bit, or I would think that they didn't need to over here. I mean, during the course of the interviews, I discovered that midwives in this country have one 1-hour anatomy lecture, which is just...
Oh, I have been teaching midwives here for many years, and they get a full course, and they need it, and it's wonderful. And we take them to the dissection lab, and it's transformative for them. So I'm shocked that it's 1 hour.
One hour. And then they remembered being given a pair of scissors to perform an episiotomy, having, had one hour lecture. What came out was that you gave them an occupation or a profession. Within seconds, they could tell you whether they would allow them in or not. It was a straight yes or no. And then when you asked them why, you could see them making up the argument on the spot. They were trying to justify their previous decision. And then when you presented the next profession, again, they would make decisions straight away. And then they would create the argument for that profession. And then sometimes they'd realize that argument was actually counter to the argument they just made. So they had to go back and change their mind. And they got, a lot of them admitted that they hadn't actually given this that much thought. They had never been pushed on why they allowed certain people in and not others.
That's so interesting. And I think it goes back to Shagan's question of this hierarchy. So where's the line? Who's included? Who's excluded?
Nobody was excluded. So the professions, let me see, can I remember the professions? I've got a picture. So the professions I asked them about were radiographer, physiotherapist, dentist, nurse, medical student, and they automatically separated it into early years medical student and late years medical student. So the one that was early years medical student they talked about, midwife, massage therapist, exercise instructor, chiropractor and osteopath, and we lumped them together because nobody knew the difference, acupuncturist and reflexology, artist, and the example was Leonardo da Vinci. So I didn't want them to think about medical illustrators. We were talking about artists, and aesthetic Botox injectors. And they ranged from 100% to 33.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been so blessed to experience here at UBC is how very inclusive we are in terms of our openness to teaching anatomy. And I mean, I'm not saying it because Claudia is here, but when I got to UBC and I began to teach here, one of the things that Claudia said is, knowledge is free. You've got to make knowledge free. You've got to let people in and let them experience this, just the wonder of the human body and not keep it behind a firewall so that only certain people can get it. And so, really, I'm proud that, we kind of have opened that. We could do more, certainly, but, we have just allowed people who have a need to learn the human body. We've given them access to the human donor and to learn from dissection. So that's one story that we do here. And maybe just to extend it to some of your work and your findings of your PhD, just in terms of, I think it relates to this idea of whose stories you're telling, because if it's the same people who've kept the gate, who've limited access, and who's, when you talk about anything, they're the only voices you hear, then you're really going to get a narrow view of what anatomy is all about. And I think part of your findings bring that out, doesn't it?
I think so. What's interesting about, so the order I recited them is the order that they would let them in percentages, but that's not the order of who actually gets in at the moment. I found it fascinating that only 66% of them would let in early years medical students, and yet 100 of them do it at the moment because that's the main student. Very few people teach. Obviously we've got some people that let in dentists. There was quite an array of understanding how much anatomy dentists needed to know. But physios and radiographers don't really feature in many people's teaching remit at the moment, and yet almost 100% would let them in. A third of them would rather that medical students weren't there in the early years. It comes down to dignity and respect of the donor, because the people that didn't want to let early year medical students in were because they didn't think early years medical students knew enough anatomy to get the best out of dissecting.
I think our approach has been maybe the reverse, to say that you get exposure to the anatomy, then you learn the anatomy. It's not that you learn anatomy as a prerequisite to coming to have exposure to the human donor. So that in my view, that's taken a little bit backwards. What do you think, Claudia?
Do you teach by dissection where you are?
Yes,
we do.
Yeah, see, a lot of the medical schools in the UK don't teach by dissection. So they have prosections. The students come in and they experience human material, but they don't dissect themselves. There's a couple of places where they do, but the vast majority, they don't go through the whole dissection process like they used to.
Yeah, it's a real changing landscape right now in terms of how we approach it in the medical undergraduate programs. I find your story so fascinating, Janet, because you are looking at anatomy in probably the most holistic way I've seen. Really, from the politics of the anatomy lab, if I can call it that, the gatekeeping, who gets in, who doesn't, the decisions that are being made, who has the privilege of dissection, the privilege of learning with human materials, and then going into a cafe and showing a needle felted heart and showing people, letting people handle it and see the vessels, the size of it, and understanding the three-dimensionality of the human body in a very intuitive, tactile way, to have people understand their own bodies. Your project with the vertebrae was transformative for those who participated. It's a beautiful approach to democratizing knowledge and making it accessible to people through making, which is something I'm really interested in, how we can engage people by engaging them to do something, to craft, to make. The fact that you had to shut it down right away with the vertebrae. And I remember I was late asking for a kit and you're like, we're done, which is wonderful, right? When you think about it, it's really wonderful that people have this thirst for knowledge. And yet in academia, we're very protective of sharing that knowledge, which is so weird. As Shagan said, it goes against everything I believe in. I feel like we're public universities. They're paying us our salaries, really. We need to give them all the knowledge we have and share that back. I'm inspired. by your work.
Oh, thank you very much. What was interesting about the vertebrae was we sent out sort of sheets explaining the vertebrae, and we used some fantastic images from Michaela Stuyver of the sort of giraffe head and moose head, and sort of so took it down to the sort of cartoony animals so they understood the shapes. But the comments that came back about how complex the shape was, and the engineering in the body, if you like, was absolutely amazing. But we got those comments back from anatomists who, on their comment sheet, said, I teach this every semester to my students, and I had never appreciated all of those shapes. Yeah, I suppose it's difficult, isn't it? If you teach it every day, you sometimes lose the wonder of the awe-inspiring bit of how the body all gets together.
Yeah, it's a shame, really, because I think it's so necessary to continually stand in awe and be amazed at the human body and how everything shape works with function, and function works collaboratively across the body. That's just so amazing. And your work, Janet, is very inspiring and brings that out really well. So thank you for all you do. So we're at that stage of the podcast where we ask our guest, Janet, what is your favorite body part?
I thought about this and I got so many, but I have a favorite thing about the body, not necessarily a body part. So this ties back to the embryology and how it all transitions whilst remaining functional. So the kidneys, they move up the body, and each time something changes, they still have to function. And the transition of the pharyngeal arches is just, they all move around and they all become something else, but they still have to carry out their function whilst they're doing it. So I think that ability to transform whilst remaining functional, it's not really a body part, but it's a body thing.
I love that. I mean, we've said this many times on this podcast that most anatomists are closeted embryologists, right? Like, we appreciate the development of the human body so much. And gosh, I'd never thought about it for all of these body systems, how they need to remain functional while changing. I do talk about it every time when I talk about the heart and sort of the cardiopulmonary system and how it's set up for life in utero and then immediately changes upon birth, and it's set up and it's ready to go. But of course, that applies to everything else as well. I love that. That's going to completely reframe how I look at embryology and how I'll teach it from here on in. Thank you for that. That's
the closet embryologist. So there's an art show. We have a Simon's Initiative of the Developing Brain at the University of Edinburgh, and they're doing an art show in August, and they put out a call to, we have a group of people who are artists and scientists that meet together. They put out a call for things, and I'm currently trying to do the topic is developing brain. So I've gone for the neural groove just as it's folded over, and we've got science coming across and the developing brain. But I'm trying to do it, I don't want to use the word properly, but so I've made a felt balloon, which would be the ball of cells, and I'm going to try and fold it and actually do embryological folding. It could end up as a big mess, but that's the plan.
That sounds amazing, Janet. I'd love to see that.
So
you
would
need
I.
to film yourself your felt ball. That's great. With your favorite part being the wonder of embryology and how structures can develop and change while still being functional, what's your least favorite body part, or I guess your least favorite thing about the human body?
Oh, okay, I've got a couple of. I don't want to say neuro, but it is kind of. I do suffer from neurophobia, but on the other hand, it's because it's so intricate and all the different bits. So it's both sort of a love and hate relationship. I guess if I had to pick the absolute not favorite body part, I'd probably go with gallbladder.
Okay, why the gallbladder?
Okay, so two reasons I get. The first one is I remember my experience of dissection, of removing it, and having to sort of, cut it so you could see inside and the sort of spiral bit down the duct. And it was just such a mess. And, it wasn't a great experience doing that. But also a couple of years ago, my mother had to have hers removed. So I guess it's not a favourite part because of the effect it had on her, but also the effect it had on me when I had to remove it during dissection.
I sympathize with that. I remember when my father had to have his gallbladder removed. It was the lead up to that was quite painful and horrible for him. So yes, we all hate gallbladder at this point. Okay, I can get on team gallbladder or anti-gallbladder or whatever. But it is nice and green, which is sort of a nice, sort of different color. I do appreciate that about it. Janet, thank you so much for joining us here today and sharing your stories. So many things that you're exploring and sharing so generously with anyone who approaches you. Please keep on inspiring the world the way you have been. Seriously, I have your brachial plexus braiding set in the hive. I think your approach of encouraging people to make and to explore, to see the anatomy in a new way, to get re-inspired, the fact that anatomists, through the exercise of needle felting a vertebra, get re-inspired by an anatomy that they already know, is remarkable. And you're making real changes in the community and probing us to think critically about our decisions and what we're doing. So thank you for all you do. And thanks for sharing your stories with us today.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's great.
Well, everyone, thank you. And that brings us to the close or the end of another episode of Body Banter. Thanks to Janet. And of course, thank you, Claudia. And we'll see you next time, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Body Banter.
We are Claudia
and Shegun.
And we look forward to having you join us for more conversations about the human body next time.